are often but not always great pollinators, and some basic bee biology. If I stand here, I'm still visible online? Great, okay. People always ask me how the bees are doing, so I'll talk a little bit about that, and then often that's followed with what we can do to help bees, and so I'll give a little bit of tips on that. So to start, maybe we'll just try to find out where everybody is at in terms of basic bee knowledge. So how would you all recognize a bee? Okay, let's fly. They fly, they buzz. Okay, this is good. Yeah. Two pairs of wings. Very good. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Often yellow and black, not always. And that can mislead you because there are other things that are yellow and black, but yes, often they do have those colors. They do. Yeah. Okay. Okay, good. Yeah. So I think you've probably all seen bees before. I'm getting that sense. Okay, that's good. So here are a few photos I've taken over the years. So there are quite a few species of bees. We'll talk about that in a sec. But from a scientific perspective, the first thing I would say is bees are actually vegetarian wasps. So bees evolved from an ancestor that was basically a wasp. Their closest relatives are ground nesting wasps like this one that would have relied on animal prey. Maybe you've seen wasps like this, digger wasps. So they'll often hunt down prey like caterpillars or crickets or flies, all kinds of things. And for these animals, they get their protein and lipids, fats, from that animal prey. And basically, bees have just transitioned to a vegetarian substitute for their protein, which is pollen. So both adult wasps and adult bees get their sugar and water from nectar, but they have to get a protein source to build babies. You cannot make a baby bee or wasp out of sugar alone. So they need a protein and fat source, and they get that from either animals or pollen. So bees are vegetarian wasps, and the trait that really distinguishes them from wasps in terms of their appearance, so vegetarian is behavior, but in terms of what's on their bodies that allows you to tell them from wasps, is that their hairs are branched. So they look like these little sort of Christmas trees, as opposed to wasps, which just have straight hairs. And I see you all looking blankly at this because this is a useless characteristic for identifying a bee. You still can't hear. Okay. So yeah, this is not something you can see with the naked eye. You have to look at them under a microscope. So more useful characteristics for identifying bees. Well, so that Nora mentioned, two pairs of wings. That also can be hard to see, especially if the bee is flying, but that does distinguish bees from flies, which only have one pair of wings. Something that's a little easier to see is bees have elbowed antennae. That doesn't distinguish them from wasps, but it does distinguish them from flies. And they will often, but not always, be carrying pollen. So I guess what that tells you is there's no single trait that's going to tell you definitively all the time that this is a bee, except for those branched hairs, which you can't see in the field. So you kind of just have to know. You get familiar with the different kinds of bees, and then you're able to recognize them in the field. Bees do come in all different sizes. This is pretty much the size range that exists. Do folks know roughly how many species of bees there are in the world? Did you say? Actually more, but you're in the right order of magnitude. And I heard some people saying thousands. So yeah, there's about 20,000 species of bees in the world. And I think the latest estimate I've heard is about 950 in Canada, and be around 450 in Eastern Canada. Yeah. Yeah, and just for comparison, there's only about 5,400 species of mammals in the world. So bees are much more diverse than mammals, but actually nowhere near as diverse as beetles. Beetles really take the cake. Okay, so perhaps you've heard about pollen baskets. So some bees do have pollen baskets on their hind legs, specifically honeybees and bumblebees. And this is a pollen basket here, actually outlined in red. It's this kind of concave, shiny surface on the hind leg where bumblebees and honeybees will pack their pollen. So it's pollen that is mixed up with nectar. So it forms this kind of paste that they somehow manage to glue onto their hind legs while flying. And that's actually not something that all bees have. So just honeybees and bumblebees have these pollen baskets. Most bees do not have that, although they do have other ways of carrying pollen. So most bees, instead of having a pollen basket, have what's called a pollen brush or a scopa. So this is a brush of hairs that allows them to carry dry pollen. Sometimes it's on the hind legs, sometimes it's on the underside of the abdomen. And then there are some species that don't have any conspicuous external pollen carrying hairs, and they actually just ingest the pollen. So they eat it and then regurgitate it for their larvae. So you actually don't see them carrying pollen on the outside of their bodies. And then there's a few bees that are really sometimes tricky to even identify as bees because they don't collect pollen at all. So I don't know if some of you have seen cuckoo bees like this one, but if you did, you might have thought it was a wasp. They're quite waspy looking, although I guarantee you under the microscope, they do have branched hairs. But they're very short hairs. They don't have any pollen carrying brushes. And that's because they act like cuckoos. So they actually invade the nests of other bees and lay their eggs in those nests. And their larvae will actually kill the larvae of the host bee and then eat the pollen that the host bee has provided for her larvae. Yeah, so I know everyone thinks bees are so nice, but some of them have this mean streak. And these are actually quite common, especially in the spring. You might, now that you know they exist, if you remember in the spring, you may notice them. Sometimes they'll fly quite slowly on the ground because they're looking for nests of the host bees to attack or waiting for the right time to go in because they got to wait for the mom bee to be absent so they can sneak in. So they don't collect pollen at all, and males don't collect pollen at all. So all of the childcare, domestic labor is done by the female bees. Yeah, it's pretty retrograde. But so you got male bees just hanging around, sometimes even on a closed flower like this one. Like he's not even trying. So male bees do visit flowers. They do need to feed on nectar to give themselves energy. And because they visit flowers and they can be quite fuzzy, they can be important pollinators, but they're just not collecting pollen to bring it home for the babies. Okay, so what is a native bee? Well, everything I've shown you so far has been a native bee, so native to North America. It's easier to actually say what is a non-native bee, and then all the rest is the native bees. And the main non-native bee that I'm sure you're all familiar with is the European honeybee. So honeybees are obviously very important for agriculture. There's a whole industry of beekeepers, and there's many hobbyist beekeepers, and they're fascinating animals. Their social behavior is amazing. They make honey, which is amazing, but they're not native. There are some other non-native species as well, much less well-known, not as abundant, not as economically important. One that we have in the city here is the European wool carder bee, Anthidium manicatum. I can talk more about that at the end if people are interested. They're really neat bees. But the important point I want to make is just that these species are not native to North America and they are not endangered. I'll come back to that with respect to the honeybees later. And there are a few other non-native species, but most of the bee species that we have around here are native to North America. Okay, so these are non-bees. Wasps. Everyone's familiar with yellow jacket type wasps. There's some other really beautiful wasps that, they visit flowers again for nectar. So sometimes they are mistaken for bees. And then there's an amazing variety of flies, some of which are quite good mimics of bees. You've probably seen most of these, or at least close relatives of these flies, bee flies. They're even called bee flies, but they are not bees. And I think here you can see pretty clearly they just have one pair of wings. Again, different from bees. And they also have kind of short, stubby little antennae. So that's probably the best way you can tell them apart from bees. Some of them are great mimics of bumblebees. This is a robber fly. So it's actually a predatory fly. It attacks other flies. But it's even evolved this mimicry where its color pattern really matches some of the local bumblebees in that area. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about pollination. I know you're Horticultural Society. I'm guessing I don't need to go over this in any great detail, but just quick reminder, pollination process, pollen has to move from one flower, the male has to move from the male parts of one flower to the female parts of another flower or to the same flower. And there are many possible agents of pollination, wind being one, animals being another. And in many plants, of course, this process is necessary for seed development and fruit production. Globally, the vast majority of plant species depend on animals for pollination. The rest can be pollinated by wind or water or just self-pollinate. About a third of global crop production benefits from animal pollination. It's a little hard to pin down a very precise number because, well, benefits from. There are lots of crops where production is increased a little bit by animals visiting flowers, but the degree of dependence varies on the situation and the exact cultivar. We do get most of our calories from wind-pollinated plants like rice and corn, but the interesting parts of our diet, most of the colorful parts of our diet, including tomatoes, these are crops that really depend entirely or to a large extent on animals for pollination. Okay, so that's pollination. Bees do a lot of that. The pollination that happens by animals, a lot of that is done by bees. So why are bees great? Well, probably these branched hairs, which are really good at holding pollen, play some role. The fact that bees are generally kind of fuzzy overall, it probably helps them transport pollen. But the other thing that really makes bees different from all the other insects that are, well, most of the other insects that are visiting flowers is that they depend on pollen for their entire lives, right? That fact that pollen is what they feed their larvae, that means they're visiting flowers all the time. That's what they're doing all day long, at least the females, visiting flowers, collecting pollen, bringing it back to the nest. So they are spending a lot of time interacting with flowers, and that can make them really important agents of pollen transfer. At the same time, important to recognize that bees are not doing it for the plant's benefit. That's an incidental byproduct of a behavior that they're doing for themselves or for their offspring. And so any pollen that ends up in a bee's pollen basket, moistened with nectar, or transported back to the nest, this is the inside of a bee nest, solitary bee nest with some balls of pollen and nectar and larvae developing on it, that pollen is not going to be helping the plants at all, right? That pollen is not going to be pollinating. It's going to be bee food. So they're in it for themselves. but they are also incidentally helping plants. Some bees are not even incidentally helping plants. Sometimes they're just not effective as pollinators at all. So here's a few examples. These little tiny stingless bees, these are tropical. We don't have these here, but we do have small bees here. Well, they're just hanging out on the anthers. They're just eating pollen. They're not doing any transferring of it to the stigma. So that is something that you will sometimes see. Sometimes you see bees that are actually robbing flowers for nectar. So this carpenter bee has actually sliced a hole in the nectar, the floral tube here, and is sucking the nectar out without contacting the reproductive parts of the flower at all. Certain bee species will have that behavior. And it can be kind of a cultural thing where, you know, a certain population will start doing it. It's not all bees that do it, but, you know, again, they're in it for their own self-interest. They're not out to help the plants. And then, of course, cuckoo bees, which are not spending nearly as much time with flowers as other bees. So they're probably less important as pollinators. So honeybees often get a lot of the credit for pollination, especially crop pollination. And to some extent, that's justified. I mean, the really convenient thing about honeybees is they form these large colonies that you can keep in a box, basically, and you can ship those boxes around to crop fields. So that's been very economically useful. But they're not necessarily the best pollinators for any given plant on a per individual visit basis. So if you think about how much pollen gets transferred when an insect makes one visit to a flower, and you compare a honeybee making that visit to any other kind of bee, they're not necessarily the best. And actually, a meta-analysis that came out a few years ago, so synthesizing the results from 72 different studies, showed that honeybees were actually less effective than the average bee in terms of their per visit pollen transfer. And for most plants studied, honeybees were not the most effective pollinator. And just to give you a couple of examples of cases where honeybees are not the best pollinators, squash. Does anyone grow squash? Do you ever see squash bees in your flowers? Okay, they do occur around here, and they're specialists on squash, so they will only visit squash flowers. They only collect pollen from squash. And squash flowers open really early in the morning, right? And then they close by early afternoon. And these bees, their timing of activity is really matched to that timing of flower opening in squash. So they're much better pollinators than honeybees. Honeybees don't even like squash pollen, and they'll tend to not visit the male flowers. If they do get squash pollen on them, they tend to groom it off. So squash bees and bumblebees are better at pollinating squash than honeybees are. Does anyone know the deal with tomatoes and peppers are the same thing? So they need to be buzz pollinated, so that bees need to grab onto the cone of anthers and buzz it to get the pollen to come out. And honeybees don't do that. I know we think of bees buzzing. Honeybees don't buzz when they're visiting flowers, whereas a lot of our native bees do, including bumblebees. Bumblebees are really good at it. And this is why greenhouse producers, you know what, all the tomatoes that you get through the winter here that come from like Leamington area, Southern Ontario, all those greenhouse grown tomatoes, they buy boxes of bumblebees. Keeps everyone awake. So you can actually buy boxes of bumblebees, the bumblebee colonies that service these greenhouse tomatoes. So they don't bother with honeybees. Honeybees are not effective for tomatoes. But there's the whole bumblebee industry in Leamington alongside the tomato industry. And then, well, orchard plants, you know, apples, cherries, they are well pollinated by honeybees. It's not that honeybees are bad at it, but bees like blue orchard bees are actually more tolerant of poor weather, and so can be active in certain conditions when honeybees just don't bother to come out. Okay, so I've already said a little bit or alluded to this a couple times. So honeybees and bumblebees are social, meaning they live in colonies with a queen, many workers. Division of labor, where the queen does the reproduction, the workers do all the foraging. A little bit different in bumblebees, but that's basically the idea of a social life cycle. And they make honey, which is a food store that allows them to survive through periods of no floral availability. But most bees are not social. Most bees are actually solitary, and they don't make honey. They do collect pollen and nectar, and sometimes they mix it into these pollen balls that sometimes resemble honey, but yeah, it's not the same thing. So these are a few examples of our local solitary bees. I think they're beautiful. Sometimes they're less conspicuous than the bumblebees and honeybees, but there's also more variety. So we got these iridescent green small carpenter bees, these glorious, I don't know what the common name is for these, melisodes. Yeah, I don't know common names for bees in general. Sorry, these are Megachile pugnata. I'll call it the pugnacious leaf cutting bee. So anyway, these are some of the local solitary bees that we have. So solitary life cycle, which I'll explain in a moment, just means that the female bee does all of the work herself. There's no colony helping her out with that labor. But to start with, I'll go over the bumblebee life cycle because I'm sure this is something that you have witnessed in some way because bumblebees are so conspicuous and amazing. So bumblebees have an annual colony life cycle. That's different from honeybees, which have perennial colonies. So in the bumblebee situation, queens do actually forage on their own. They're much more independent than a honeybee queen. So a bumblebee queen emerges in spring and starts visiting flowers and initially just feeding herself. And then once she has found a location in which to nest, she will start collecting pollen and nectar to start a colony. And actually, when bumblebee queens first come out in the spring and are looking for a place to nest, that's often when you can get a really good look at them because they will be flying kind of slowly around the ground and like poking any crevice they see that could be an entryway to a good nesting location. They'll go and explore it. And it seems to me that they always reject. I never see them like actually pick a location. I usually see them go in and then come back out and keep looking. In any case, once they've found a good location, they create a honey pot. So bumblebees, again, do make honey, and they'll build a pollen ball, and they'll lay their eggs in that ball and incubate their eggs. So bumblebees, unlike many insects, can generate their own body heat. And so they press their abdomen to that batch of eggs and help speed up development that way. Once those eggs develop and consume enough pollen to go through metamorphosis and emerge as workers, they then take over all the foraging duties from the queens. So you don't see the queens after midsummer, really. At that point, they're just staying in the hive, and the workers, their daughters, are going out and doing all of the pollen and nectar collecting. A few generations of workers are produced over the course of the summer, and then towards the end of the summer, the colony enters a reproductive phase and starts producing new queens and males. And so late in the summer, you start to see large bees again. Those are the new generation of queens. And also you'll start to see male bees like this one. And sometimes you'll even see a mating pair or even a mating ball. Sometimes you'll see a queen with 6 or 7 males trying to get in on the action. Once that's accomplished, or basically at the end of the season when temperatures get cold, the workers and males all die, and the old queen as well will die. But the new queens that are inseminated will find a place to hibernate, usually underground or at least under leaves, and they'll survive the winter like that and then repeat the cycle the following spring. So this is one reason you might want to be careful if you're digging in the soil in the fall. Okay, so that's the bumblebee life cycle. Solitary bees, it's a little bit simpler. Basically, the adult female will be active at a certain point in the season that depends on the species. Sometimes it's spring, sometimes it's summer. She will decide on a place to nest. For many species, that's in the soil, but for some species, it's above ground cavities. In each brood cell, she'll pile up some pollen and nectar. She'll lay an egg in there. That egg hatches into a larva that will eat all the pollen, pupate, so undergo metamorphosis, and then emerge. And usually that cycle happens over the span of a year, but in some species there can be 2 generations a year, and in some species it can actually take more than a year. Okay, stings. So one of my favorite party tricks is grabbing bees and showing them to people like this. And so this is, yeah, these are bees I have held to take photos of, and they were angry. I mean, this guy was buzzing, but I was able to do this safely. Do you know why? Because they're males. Yeah. So if you can recognize the males from the females, this is something you can do. And I was gonna say, impress all your friends. I don't think I've impressed anyone particularly, but I keep hoping. Oh, good. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so that's fun. You do have to be able to reliably sex them, which, yeah, takes a little bit of time. But it should also be noted that not all species will sting. I mean, so there's a lot of tiny solitary bees that their stingers are just quite weak, and so they can't necessarily penetrate your skin, or you really have to get them angry. Certain bees are actually more likely to bite than sting. But among our native bees, the ones that can sting, like if they can sting you once, they can sting you many times. You've probably heard that bees can only sting once. Yeah, so that's only true of honeybees. Yeah, so honeybees have these barbed stingers such that when they stick it into you, and if they then fly away, it rips their abdomen apart. But that's not the case in any other bees. So bumblebees, for example, have a smooth stinger, and they can sting you repeatedly, and they will if you approach or if you mess with their colony, as I can attest. Okay, so some other bee biology. Species vary a lot in the breadth of their diet. So some species are really specialized and will only collect pollen from one, usually it's a genus or family of plants. So the squash bees I already mentioned are, they'll visit all different kinds of squash flowers, but only squash. This is evening primrose mining bee. So they only visit plants in the genus Enothera. But then there's species like bumblebees and some of our beautiful bicolored sweat bees that are total generalists. They'll visit all different kinds of flowers, collect pollen from all different kinds of plants. This is actually something, I find this really interesting, like why specialize, right? Why sacrifice all these other potential floral options to just focus on this one kind of plant? So that's something my lab is working on for our research. Okay, and then nesting habitat. So I did mention already, most species nest in the ground. Some nest in above ground cavities. This is kind of a typical bee nest entrance. Sometimes You may notice those. I notice them especially in the spring, I guess, when the vegetation is not so tall, they're a little bit more conspicuous. This is what it can look like if you excavate a bee nest. So they can dig tunnels that are actually quite deep, which is impressive. It doesn't look like they have any real digging machinery on their bodies, but they're able to do that. And then there are species that nest above ground. About 30% of all bee species are ones that use above ground cavities. And some of them like to nest in pithy stems, so like, or hollow stems, so bamboo or raspberry cane, that kind of thing. And others like holes in wood. So that is a habitat that you can mimic with bee hotels. Within those nests, just to give you an idea of what's going on inside, this is kind of a typical solitary bee nest of a kind that you'd get in one of these bee hotels or in any sort of natural wood structure. The mother bee has built this series of brood cells, and she puts a lot of care into making these partitions between each brood cell. This is a bumblebee queen incubating her brood. She's got some, looks like these are cocoons developing here. This is the inside of a leafcutter bee nest, again, from one of these bee hotels. And I think it's quite beautiful what they do with all the pieces of leaf. You may not appreciate it so much when the segments of leaf are taken from your rose bush. They really seem to like rose bushes. Has anyone noticed that? Yeah. There seem to be, like, clearly this species, whatever this is, has not been attacked, but they really like this desmodium here. Yeah, but I think it's very neat work that they do, but I guess not everyone appreciates it. Okay. How are we doing? How's everyone doing? Okay. So let's talk about how the bees are doing. So this is a question I often get, and I guess this is the annoying academic answer is it depends. But it does depend which ones you're talking about. So often when people ask me that, how are the bees doing? It's because they've heard something about honeybees having a hard time. So I'm going to show you some data on honeybees, because often what you will hear is anecdote or sort of a time point, like this past winter was tough on honeybees. Often you'll hear something like that. So these are data come from the Food and Agriculture Organization. On this y-axis is the number of hives in the world. This is documented, reported hives. So this is going to be a low estimate of total number of hives. On this x-axis, it's the number of hives in Canada. So Canada is going to be in blue triangles. The world is going to be in green circles over time since the 1950s. Okay. So but honeybees are not declining at a global scale, at least in terms of hive numbers, and a hive can contain tens of thousands of individual bees. They've continued a fairly steady rise worldwide, and in Canada, not so steady, but there's not a decline. What has happened in the 1980s, Varroa mites got introduced to North America, and they were a huge problem for beekeepers in the 80s, and they continue to be a problem. They are still a big issue for beekeepers. They require beekeepers to apply miticides to control the mites, but the miticides themselves are a bit toxic. So there are challenges associated with keeping bees, but they are not an endangered species. I would say they're an agricultural species, essentially, kind of livestock. There are problems in livestock management with any kind of livestock, but what I'm much more concerned about is the wild bees, because they don't have an industry looking out for them. Nobody's even counting them at a global scale. So how are the wild bees doing? Well, only bumblebees are really well studied. So we do have somewhat good data on bumblebee populations in North America. I could go on at length about the quality of the data, but anyway, we do have some data on bumblebees. And what we do know for sure about bumblebees as a consequence of that is that some species are doing fine. I am sure 100% that you have all seen common eastern bumblebees. That's got to be the most common and conspicuous bee species in Ottawa. They're wonderful. I love them dearly, but they are very common. I love them dearly and they are very common. That's how I should put that. But some species have declined dramatically. I'm sure some of you have heard about the rusty patched bumblebee. Have any of you seen one? Amazing. They have not been seen in Canada since 2009. They used to be common, but yeah, they're critically endangered in Canada and in the US. And the yellow-banded bumblebee, I do still see these every summer, but they used to be common and now they are not. And nobody completely knows why, although there's many theories and some correlates. But basically, there's quite a few species of bumblebees that are doing poorly. We can come back to causes in a bit, but others that are doing well. When it comes to bees other than bumblebees, which is most bee species, we just don't have great data. But I will show you some information from two global studies that I think are quite illuminating and depressing. So one study that came out in 2020 synthesized synthesized data from a whole bunch of different sites around the world to look at overall patterns in terrestrial insect abundance. So it was not specific to bees, but it was all land living insects. And what they were able to show is, by and large, populations are going down. So all of the red points here are locations where the trend was overall downward over a period of a few decades. The blue points are areas where the trend was upward. So overall, they found a 9% decline per decade in terrestrial insect abundance. In 2021, a study looked more specifically at bees and not at abundance, but at numbers of species detected. And their main finding was if you looked at the number of bee species detected globally per decade, it dropped way off in the 2010s compared to previous decades. 25% fewer bee species detected in the last decade. Okay, so that's not encouraging. So that brings me to what we can do to help. And I guess the first place to start is just to be aware of what the threats are. And the number one threat for all wildlife still is habitat loss. And that's a really tough one to be able to combat as an individual. It's happening at such a large scale. But I do think it's important to recognize that it's actually easier to combat this at an individual level than this. So land use change is huge. It is accompanied by pesticide use because most of that habitat loss is conversion of natural habitat to agriculture. Some of it is to urban development or suburban development, but much of it is to agriculture. And so much of it is accompanied by applications of pesticides. Climate change is definitely growing as a threat. There's more and more evidence showing that that is a problem for wild bees, especially for some species of bumblebees. This is pretty well supported as a problem. For some species, diseases or parasites are a problem, but that cannot explain general declines. Those would all be just specific for individual species. And then A possible threat, and there's also growing evidence for this, is actually competition from honeybees. So consider a healthy honeybee hive collects between 2.5 and 9 kilos of pollen per month. So in 3 months, so like a short summer, a single hive removes from the ecosystem enough pollen and nectar, a quantity of pollen and nectar that could have raised over 100,000 native solitary bees. So if floral resources, pollen and nectar, are the thing that limits wild bee populations, it's clear that honeybees are going to be having a negative impact on their populations. Okay, so what you can do, advocate for habitat preservation, support local small-scale diversified agriculture as much as possible. These kinds of agricultural systems are much better at supporting all kinds of populations of wildlife, including bees, than monocultures. In your own gardens, where you have much more control, you can provide flowers that are producing nectar and pollen. Maybe not every species produces both of those things. Roses don't produce nectar, but if you've got a variety of species, you are providing those resources collectively. Ideally, you want to have flowers that bloom at different times, which is what you want anyway for aesthetics. Of course, you want things that bloom throughout the season. Well, that's also going to support the bees. And preferably plants that are native to Eastern North America. Bees don't necessarily discriminate. There are lots of non-native plants that bees will visit, and some of them they will even use the pollen from those species, but the chances are higher that you're going to be supporting our native bee species and giving them nutritious food if you're using native plants with which our native bees have co-evolved. I wanted to mention this study that came out just a few years ago. It was actually led by a former grad student and a colleague of mine at the University of Ottawa, because they looked at the bee communities in residential yards in Ottawa. They studied, I think it was 27 Ottawa yards for one summer. And they actually went out there. The purpose of the study initially was to look at how tree cover and like impermeable, like amount of pavement, how those things affected the local bee community. And what they found was that those things, the sort of landscape scale effects, were not that important. What was the most important thing in terms of the number of bee species they found in a yard was how many plant species were present in that yard. So the more diversity of plants you plant, the more diversity of bees you're able to support. So in total, they got 98 bee species just in that one summer of sampling, and that's within the city of Ottawa. So I think that's pretty good. We've, in my lab, definitely documented more species than that, but that's with sampling, in Gatineau Park and agricultural areas. So there's definitely over 100 species in our area that you would have a chance of attracting with a good diversity of flowers in your yard. I don't know if people need suggestions. I'm sure you're all far more expert gardeners than I am. I'm a total novice. But these are a few of the plants that I know and love, and that bees also know and love. So a few suggestions here. Violets are great. We have various spring blooming lilies, of course. Dutchman's breeches, amazing. And oh yeah, bloodroot is great. But the big one I'll say for spring is the trees. Tree pollen is super important for bees in the spring. So willows, you may have noticed they get covered in bees in the spring. And some of those bee species that visit willow for pollen, it's not a showy plant. You might not think of it as this great flower, but there are specialist bees that will only collect pollen from willow. So it's really important resource, and it's really present early in the spring. So it's kind of unique in that respect. Of course, things like cherry trees, serviceberry are great resources as well, but even less conspicuous trees like maple flowers, even oak, which is wind pollinated, that pollen is an important resource for bees in the spring. And the reason we know this in part, I mean, ours is by no means the only study looking at this, but a former PhD student in my lab did a study looking at how bees were using the Gatineau Park forest. Specifically, she sampled in the understory and in the canopy. And over the course of 2021, she collected 1,400-ish bees, and 2/3 of them were up in the canopy, only a third in the understory. And that's despite the fact that the understory of the forest in spring is beautiful, right? It's carpeted with spring ephemerals, but the bees were up in the trees. And when she dissected the guts of 400 of them, most contained tree pollen, especially maple. So that's what they're doing up there for the most part. This is one of the common, beautiful spring flying bees that is particularly associated with the forest around here. Okay, and then a few more native suggestions for the summer. Really anything in the rose family and the mint family. So let's see, what have we got? Cinquefoils, obedient plant, penstemons are great. There's all kinds of things in the aster family. The goldenrods are wonderful. Joe Pyeweed is amazing. Cornus dogwood is a really great resource too in that sort of June period, sort of between the spring and summer. And it too supports some specialist bees that will only collect pollen from dogwoods. And same for the evening primrose. Okay. So flowers are really the big thing. If you can provide good floral diversity, that's the best thing you can do to help bees. But the other piece that I don't want to overlook is nesting habitat. Again, most bees nest in the ground, but if you do want to provide above ground nesting habitat, dead wood with natural holes in it is great. You can build something yourself. So this is an example from Fletcher Wildlife Garden. Sometimes you'll see structures like that. We can look at this one after if people are interested. But just don't forget that natural nesting habitat, it's maybe less conspicuous, maybe gives you less of a feeling that you have done something, but just allowing natural habitat to be there is super important. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation has made some recommendations for how to maintain stems in gardens to allow habitat for stem nesting bees. So basically leave the dead flowers over the winter, cut them back partway in spring, but not all the way to the ground. So if you leave some stem, that will both act as kind of a stake for your new floral growth, but also allow bees to nest in those stems. And then I guess most obviously, just try not to hurt the native bees. So avoiding pesticides is good. Avoid too much tidying if you can resist the temptation. And I would definitely recommend not keeping honeybees. I don't know how many enemies I'm making saying that, but here we go. Okay, so take home message, keeping honeybees is not equivalent to saving the bees. It can be really interesting and rewarding for lots of reasons, but it's kind of like keeping chickens. Like you wouldn't kid yourself that you're saving wild birds by keeping chickens. So same logic goes for honeybees. So our wild native bees are super important. I think they're beautiful. Hopefully you do too. Diverse, wonderful in every way. And bee-friendly gardening is it's pretty safe. I mean, you kind of have to work at it to get stung. Unless you have a bumblebee colony and you like kick it, I would say that would not be safe. And it's totally manageable and it's super rewarding, as I'm sure you know already. Like if you build it, they will come, as Barrett Erickson of the Corner Pollinator Garden says. it doesn't take a whole lot of investment in flowers to get bees to come and visit. So I will end there. Little plug for the Wild Pollinator Partners website. If you want more information, there's great resources there. And I feel like I've gone kind of long, but I can take questions if people are interested.
So we'll take questions from the room, and then just a reminder that we can take questions from the chat for the people on Zoom. So we'll count on you. So I'll go around with the microphone.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I noticed that you didn't mention dandelions, and we get told we should know over dandelions because they're the first thing that the bees can access in the spring. Is that accurate?
Okay, it's complicated. So dandelions are a great source of nectar in the early spring. The pollen is not a great resource for most bees, and many bees will actually groom it off themselves rather than consume it, but they are an important nectar source. So yeah, that's the complicated part. I'd say they're definitely better than nothing.
Interesting. Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation. So my garden is on a patio. It's quite a large one,
Okay.
right across from a very huge parking lot.
Ah.
I do have bees come.
Yep.
So I have a couple of questions. Number one, how would I tell whether they are honeybees? Because I do know that there is a honeybee colony,
Okay.
probably 20 blocks away on a rooftop.
Okay.
I know that. So an easy identification to know what kind of bee I am.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
also, where are those bees going after they leave? Because they're not living on my
Right. Right.
concrete-ish patio and
Right.
not in the parking lot. So I don't know,
Yeah.
they come
Yeah.
and they do their thing and
Yeah.
they're lovely, but then where do they go?
Yeah, and it's a great question. So for honeybee identification, I do have a few specimens here if anybody wants to look afterward. But honeybees in general, they're very consistent in size. So they're honeybee sized. I know that's super unhelpful. About this big. And they're I think of them as kind of a muddy, yellow, brownish, orange color. They are somewhat variable in color. They have hairy eyes, which is weird, but also a little bit hard to see. Yeah, so it's you have to look at some examples. Where they're coming from. So if they're honeybees, they could be coming from quite far. Honeybees, they can travel as much as, even some estimates are 10 kilometers. I don't think they do that habitually, but they can certainly fly a few kilometers. Smaller bees and many of the solitary bees wouldn't be traveling that far, but they could still travel a few hundred meters. So their nests could be somewhere else, and they will certainly remember where they've had floral patches and they remember their homes. So they have very good spatial memory and navigation skills, even the solitary bees, and will find their way back home to wherever their nest is. Yeah.
One more here.
Sorry about that. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, really interesting. We have a lot of insects or flying insects, bees, wasps, who knows, but we used to have a lot of wasps under our carport.
Okay.
And now, surprise, surprise, my husband noticed that in our big new evergreen tree in the front, we've got a huge wasp nest.
Okay.
I'm sure it's a wasp nest.
Okay.
But anyway, so we've planted, two things have happened in the past couple of years. In the little wooden flower containers. I watered it once and wow. So I thought they were wasps. So maybe from what you're saying, maybe it was bees coming after me. I have to run inside because they were coming right after me. But so I'm very careful now when I'm watering those, and I'm thinking I'm not going to use them anymore. I'll just use the flower beds, the new flower beds. But the anise hyssop really attracts a lot.
That is true.
So a lot of bumblebees, but we do get a lot of different types of bees or wasps or whatever. So I don't even know what we get. And I was wondering if you might hazard a guess. So we've got some evening primrose, some monard, some bee balm, and some cardinal flowers. But it seems to be the anise hyssop that really gets them interested.
Yeah, so that's a great point about the anise hyssop, super popular. I also have some, so that's in the mint family. So that's definitely one of those examples. It's just seems to be popular with a whole range of pollinators. Really hard to say what you specifically had, but things nesting in planters, all kinds of things will, if they came out and were aggressive. I mean, it was probably, well, did they look like fuzzy bumblebees or were they, you weren't, you were collecting data? Yeah, so it was probably wasps. So there's a couple of introduced species of wasps that will typically nest underground and, native ones as well, but yeah, and they can be aggressive and they do form colonies. The good news is they're annual colonies, so they won't come back in the same place. All kinds, yeah, all kinds of bees. So it would be little solitary bees. I'm sure you got sweat bees of various kinds. I'm sure you've got mining bees of various kinds, bumblebees, leaf cutters, yeah, all kinds. Yeah, and I have some examples here and books here if you want to flip through and see if anything looks familiar. Yeah. You guys are so much more enthusiastic than my class. I was just lecturing before that. I asked them if there's questions and it's crickets.
Thank you so much for your information. I wondered how the temperatures this summer and the drought affected our native bees.
Yeah, that is a great question. The drought, okay, so coincidentally, I actually just had a paper come out from my lab. This was based on work in Colorado, but it was about the importance of drought. And the main thing is that it dries up the flowers, right? And so just there's fewer flowers and the flowers are producing less nectar. And so that does seem, at least in our study over several years in Colorado, we found there did seem to be a negative effect on the bee populations because of that reduction in floral resources. The temperatures, I mean, if it gets extremely hot, that can be harmful. It's really, I don't have any specific data to say like that this summer was particularly one way or another, and bees have a certain resilience, all species do, and then there's differences between species. So I'm not aware of any direct impacts that way, but I would be surprised if the drought did not have an impact. Yeah.
Speaking about high in temperatures, I have in my backyard very shallow clay pots for birds to drink
Yeah.
and have a bath.
Yeah.
And I noticed last 2 years bees were coming to the water. So I add one more place very shallow and put the like a straw pieces on it, just for bees. So it was obvious that they need water too if it's very hot.
Interesting. So there are various insects that will come to water and use water in various ways. In all of my years working with bees, I have never seen a native bee go to water for food. Like, yeah, never. It doesn't mean it never happens, but I think it's extremely rare. They normally get all of their water needs from nectar. I think that's different for honeybees. So honeybees do use moisture to help evaporatively cool the hive. And they may collect some water to help with that, especially if conditions are very dry and they're not getting enough nectar. I think that's possible. But the insects, so that could be what you saw. It could have been honeybees. There's also other insects, including flies. Some of the flies that mimic bees will also come to water because they have larvae that are actually aquatic, so they could be laying their eggs there. And then there are various wasps that will take water, and that's really for use in their nest construction. So yeah, so it's hard to know exactly what you saw, but I'm sure you were helping something. But I don't know which species it would have been.
Just last 2 years.
Interesting.
It's awesome. 7 years.
Yeah, interesting.
So we'll take we'll take some questions from the people online. So one question was, I thought there was some caveats about using bee hotels. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. I'll infer what the word was. Caveat. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. So I guess I would say the thing I like about bee hotels is they let you get to know the bees really well. Like as a educational tool for engagement, they're amazing. Like you can see the entire life cycle of the bee. You can watch an individual bee work on her nest over a period of several days. It's really, I find it quite moving actually to see these, like to get to know these individual animals living their whole lives, doing all this work. I think they're wonderful for that. I don't necessarily think that I'm boosting bee populations by putting out habitat like this. So in my lab, we did do one study where we found that adding nesting habitat like this did boost bee numbers, at least in the short term, in apple orchards. But the caveat, I think that this person is alluding to probably is that if you have high densities of these boxes, you can actually attract a lot of parasites. And if they're not well built, like if there's a lot of cracks that allow parasites to get in, you can end up actually sustaining more parasite populations than bee populations. I mean, parasites are animals too, and you know, I guess they've got a right to live too. So I guess I think having one house like this is basically not going to make a difference one way or the other in terms of populations. And so I see its main purpose as being educational.
Thank you. So we'll take, there's one more question here. I'm just trying to minimize. This is not working. It's working. It's working.
Okay, sorry. I didn't forget about you.
Hi, I design and manage the raised bed garden at Lansdowne. So I look after and manage the raised bed garden at Lansdowne Park. And I've been told that we actually have a quite large diversity of bees
I bet you do.
in the garden. And I think it's probably because we grow food and flowers and
Yeah.
there are a number of fruit trees in the
Yeah.
area. So if you want to come to the garden sometime and look around, there is quite I know there's sweat bees. There's some really tiny bees I've never been able to photograph. They're so tiny, but we have a large diversity of bees. I do have a general question. You talk about keeping the stems of flowers. What particular flowers are best for that?
Okay, I don't know.
Hollow stems.
Yeah, probably hollow stems. Yeah. So
Like, is it bigger, hollower stems or ones that have corky fibers in them or?
So different species like different things. So I don't want to say there's any one that would be absolutely useless. Hollow stems for sure have probably the greatest potential. But to be honest, the plants where I absolutely know that bees will use them are actually not perennials or not herbaceous perennials. It's things like raspberry and elderberry. So different kind of thing. I cut back my echinacea, rudbeckia, whatever, to that kind of height in hopes that things will occupy those stems. And I don't think I've ever seen anything nesting in them yet.
Okay.
So.
And what does the colony look like? Where do they place those? You showed us what they look like, but where?
Yeah, so it would be like you've got your stem, they will make a series of nest cells
Okay.
inside
But
that.
there was one, was it the bumblebee that's more rounded looking?
Yes, I
Where do you
neglected to
find
say.
those?
Yeah, I neglected to say where a bumblebee's nest. That's a good point. So they tend to look for cavities like an old, like abandoned mouse burrow would be one option, or just like a gap between rocks and a rock wall or under a building. Or sometimes a hole in a tree, like a bigger hole in a tree. Yeah.
But not near the ground.
Sometimes in the ground.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so we'll take a few more because I neglected this side of the room, obviously.
Oh, okay. Well, two questions actually. One is rather silly, but I've often wondered. So, do bees sting birds and squirrels and other animals or other insects? What do they sting aside from
Oh, yeah.
a human that gets it?
Oh, that's a great question. Not silly at all. Yeah, so they definitely do sting birds. And so it's thought that, I mean, if a bird tries to eat them, like they're not going out and attacking birds, but if a bird tries to eat a bee, and that's probably like a major reason why they have stingers. Yeah, so, and if a squirrel or a raccoon attacked a bumblebee colony, which can happen, especially, raccoon or a skunk might dig up a colony and they will sting those invaders. The other thing they will sting is cuckoo bees. So any invader, like a cuckoo, there's some wasps also that will come into nests and the host bees will sting them. Yeah.
And the other question, so they live wherever they live according to their species. How far do they typically go around in the day when they go around looking for things? I don't know how they know where things are. Sometimes I think they're far away, but what's their sort of radius of travel?
That is a wonderful question that I feel like I get asked this we ask this as scientists, we ask this question multiple times a month, like how far do they fly? So there's a few estimates. It's just so hard to know because they're too small to put tracking devices on for the most part. Getting there. Bumblebee queens you can, but yeah, so they can go a few hundred meters. So there was a really interesting study that used specialist bees nesting in a structure like this and put pots of their host plant out at like 10 meters from the nest and then gradually moved the pots further away. And they knew that was the only host plant in the environment. So they could actually tell like how far are the bees willing to go. And what they found was that most bees didn't even want to go further than 100 meters, but some did. And again, depends on the species, but yeah, so we're talking about on the order of tens to hundreds of meters, probably. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. So I don't think we have any more questions. This was fascinating, and obviously by the quality of questions too, but your presentation was absolutely fascinating.